Welcome back to Keepers of Our Republic, a weekly nonpartisan podcast talking to election officials and judges about defending the rule of law and free and fair elections, also known as how we keep our republic. I'm your host, Tate Fall. If this is your first time joining us, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button and join us here every week on Thursdays for these conversations. Today, I'm joined by Milton Kidd. Milton serves as the Director of Elections and Voter Registration for Douglas County, Georgia. He's worked in election administration for over a decade and has served in multiple roles across Georgia's election system, including experience in Fulton County and DeKalb County. As director, Milton is committed to strengthening public trust in the election process by improving the voter experience, supporting poll workers and election staff, increasing operational efficiency, and helping voters better understand how elections are administered. He believes that transparency, accuracy, preparation, and clear communication are essential to protecting democracy and serving the public. Thanks, Milton, for joining me today.
Good morning.
Why don't you start off by telling our listeners a little bit about yourself, how you got started in elections, and also tell us through all of the craziness, why do you stay?
Okay. I serve as Director of Elections and Voter Registration for Douglas County, Georgia. My background is in public administration and psychology, and I think that both of those fields show up every day in election work. Elections are not just about laws, equipment, ballots, procedures. They are about people, trust, access, behavior, and public service. I got into elections because I believe in government service, but I stayed because I realized how deeply this work matters. Most people see the final act of an election. They walk into a polling place, check in, cast their ballot, and leave. But behind that moment are months and sometimes even years of preparation, testing, logistics, security, legal compliance, and human effort. I stay because voters deserve competent, honest, and steady elections administration. I stay because the people doing this work, the poll workers, the election staff, the county officials, and the volunteers are the backbone of democracy. And I stay because even in difficult times, I believe this work is honorable. Democracy does not maintain itself. People have to show up and do the work.
I love it. I think that it's it's one of those things that, and I've talked with my other guests about it, that you get into this and you either love it or you leave, right? And that's why we keep showing up, is because you really deeply care. And that's really unique. You talk to your friends about their jobs, and a lot of times they're like, "Yeah, I like what I do." But that's not how election officials are. We want to talk about it all the time. We go to happy hour to talk about it more. When we're at conferences, is what we talk about at dinner, and it's just something that we care deeply about, and I love that that's so clear in you and the work that you do.
For me, this is how, as a country, we've chosen to govern ourselves. This work has to work because this is one of the fundamental aspects of what it means to be an American, is our system of democracy and how we are governed. Um, Elections are the governed, essentially giving a mandate to those who govern us. So this is what it means to be an American. This is for me one of the most American work that you can actually ever do.
Yeah, I totally agree. I love it. Well, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about Douglas County, how many voters you have, number of precincts, staff members, and anything unique about Douglas?
Okay. Douglas County is a growing metro Atlanta community. We roughly serve between 114 to 118,000 active registered voters, depending on where we are in the election cycle. We operate 25 election day precincts, and for major elections, most were advanced voting locations. We typically run 7 advanced voting locations. One of the things for me is I like to believe that we punch far above our weight as compared to a metro county our size. Even operating 7 advanced voting locations is unique for most of the counties our size. One of the unique things about Douglas County is that we are large enough to have the complexity of a metro county, but still small enough that voters expect a direct personal level of service.
Mm.
People know us, they call us, they come into our office, they expect answers as they should. This means that our team has to be both technically strong and community facing. We are also elections administrators in an environment where laws, procedures, technology, voter expectation, public scrutiny are constantly changing. So the work is not just about running elections, it's about preparing for contingencies, training people well, communicating clearly, and making sure that the voter experience is smooth and transparent as possible. I'm proud of this environment that we have made in Douglas County, which includes strengthening our training, improving logistics, expanded communication, and refining internal procedures and making sure that our staff and our poll workers understand not just the work we do, but the why behind the work too, to get buy-in from everyone. I think you get a better elections experience when the workers understand why we are all here.
I totally agree. I am always shocked to hear that you're right around 100 and 125,000 voters because you guys operate like a 500,000 voter county. I mean, the work you guys do is just so much larger, it feels, than that. And you're right. I think you guys way punch above your weight class. You have that dichotomy of being a metro, but then also having areas that are not metro at all. But then you guys are growing like crazy. So you're constantly having new voters come in that aren't familiar with how it works in Georgia, how it works in Douglas. And so I think that voter education and the training of your staff that you work so hard on is paying off because you have built such a strong relationship with your voters where I think they really trust you guys and they do call you and expect that the answers you give them that they believe you. And that's not something that a lot of counties have, unfortunately. And that speaks to the work you and your team have done there. I know you and I have talked about this many times when I was still in Cobb, about the difficulties you faced in this role, from racial slurs being hurled at you to death threats, safety concerns. I'd love for you to share with our listeners a little bit about that and really how that's impacted you both personally and professionally.
That is possibly the hardest part of the work that we do to actually talk about, but I think it is important to be honest about it. Elections across this country and election workers across this country have experienced a level of hostility that most people never see. For me personally, that has included racial slurs, moments where my safety and security have had to be taken seriously because it was threatened. Um, it has changed how you move as an elections official. It has changed how I feel that the public sometimes interacts with my staff, how you approach public comment, how you move in your office, and even how you deal with your family. And I want people to understand that elections officials are not just these abstract government figures. We are human beings, we have families, we are staff members just trying to do our job. We are poll workers. Poll workers are your neighbors, they are your church members, they are veterans, they are teachers, they're everyday people doing this job. It is not this ambiguous feature, ambiguous people doing this. And your actions and your interactions with them, they have real impact. This work can be exhausting, this work can be demoralizing, but it has made me more committed to telling the truth about the workers, about our experience as government officials, trying to do the very best with sometimes limited resources, with sometimes not the best funding sources to be able to provide our workers with the things that they should have as it relates to their safety and security concerns. But I know that the individuals that operate in this space are some of the most committed individuals, or some of the most dedicated individuals to the work that they do, because once again, they understand that our work is the work of democracy, is the work of maintaining what it essentially means to be an American, is the work that is basically giving everyday Americans access to be able to voice their opinion on how they're governed and who governs them. So it is, and I don't want those threats, and I don't want that idea to be the most pervasive thing in people's minds. What I do want people to take into account is, despite all of that, people still show up and people still making it way for voters to cast their ballots, to making sure that the ballot box is still accessible to every citizen of this county and of this nation. That is what I want people to take away. I do want elected officials and the individuals to be mindful before you hurl some of the most atrocious things at everyday citizens, because poll workers and poll officials are everyday citizens. Is that, is this how you would want to be treated? Is this how you would want to be spoken to? And use that as your North Star when you are engaging with elections officials, when your passions run high, when your temperature may be flared. Take a moment and remember that these are regular people before you begin to engage, before you begin to type that comment, before you begin to do that phone call with another human being. Give them the grace that you would want extended to you in your everyday life. That's my message toward anyone interacting with another human being, not just elections officials, but in this time and effort when misinformation runs rapid, I would ask you to extend that courtesy to every elections official.
Thank you for sharing that. I totally agree. I think we've gotten into just such a I don't know, like a downfall of how we converse with each other. And it's tough, when voters see something, on Facebook or on the news and it upsets them and they call into their local office and they're yelling at you, like you said, that's your neighbor that's on the other end of the phone. That's not, the news anchor or the anonymous person on Facebook. That's a real human that showed up to work that day to help that person. And I think sometimes we definitely lose touch of that. So thank you for sharing that. I think that that's a very important message. Um, Kind of a little bit of a pivot. You and I have spent a lot of time at the Capitol, at state election board meetings, at hearings, talking to elected officials and legislators and state election board members. And you're a really important and outspoken advocate in the election law space, particularly around how these laws deeply impact election officials. You do such a good job of reminding whoever it is we're talking to. The impacts, the fiscal impacts, the HR impacts, the work hours impacts, and you are always there and they know that you're going to bring them facts and data to back up what you say. And I'd love for you to share with us a little bit about how you got started in that work in election law and what are you seeing as the most pressing election law issues facing our officials today?
Okay. I became more outspoken because I kept seeing laws and proposed laws being discussed in ways that sounded simple on paper, but were extremely complicated in practice. Election law does not live in this vacuum. Every change has implications to real people in real counties with real budgetary concerns, with real equipment, real deadlines, and real voters standing in line sometimes. Sometimes people writing or debating election law do not fully understand the operational impact on local elections officials. A change may sound minor, but it may require new equipment, new training, new ballot design, new chain of custody procedures, new voter education, new staff, and additional funding, additional funding, additional funding, additional funding. The
That's right.
unfunded mandate. become a staple in elections administration. And one of the things that I say, you can have what you want, but you just have to give me the means to pay for it. A lot of people do not understand how elections are actually funded in this state and probably in most states and counties throughout the country. We receive nominal election funding from the state, nominal funding from the federal government. If I could make one plea, it would be for the federal government and for state governments to create a dedicated election funding source. We say we support elections in this country. Let's fund elections to the level that we say we support elections. You can't just keep talking about anomalies in elections administration without providing a means by which all of those things can be corrected. It's important. I come from a background where people say, "Put your money where your mouth is."
That's right.
You want adequate elections, you want safe, secure elections, that requires you to fully fund elections. The burden of elections right now are completely upon in the state of Georgia, are completely upon the backs of local communities. On last year, we had state elections that would not have happened had it not been for changes in election law that year. But those state elections were completely funded by the voters of these communities. Where is the funding for changes to elections? When you change the way we vote, when you change systems, you should provide an adequate funding source that is not the property taxes of local communities.
Absolutely. I think we see that so much, the state will set aside funding for equipment or they'll purchase the initial equipment and then that's it. But like you mentioned, there's so much more than that. There's having to redo training, having to reprint poll worker manuals, having to redo your forms, having to change, buy new bags to carry that equipment, having to buy new carriers for that equipment. There's so many things that go into changing a system that's not just the physical system itself. And I think that there's a major disconnect there with our legislators. I think it's not something that they maybe think about, even though we're there reminding them about it. I think it's tough to sometimes get that message across.
It's the upkeep, it's the maintenance, it's the personnel. If you were at your job and with your staff, I know you know this very firsthand, individuals that have not had a cost of living increase, individuals that see their grocery bills going up, that see every aspect of their life increasing, and they have remained at the same compensation level for the last decade and are expected to show up to work every day and perform with a smile on their face and interact with the public. Sometimes with even the general public, they recognize public servants in other capacity. You acknowledge the difficulties of a police force. You acknowledge the difficulties of firefighters. But what you don't acknowledge is those elections officials operated in a pandemic. They could not take off. They were in small rooms. They were showing up to work every day because this work requires you to physically be present, but their compensation levels never change. There are sometimes seen on the low end of the totem pole, even when you talk about operational budgets. Elections offices are some of the most underfunded federal and state workers and county workers that you will run into. And we sometimes don't have individuals advocating for our position, which is one of the reasons why I have chosen to step up and be that advocate and be that public facing person. Sometimes it means put a target on your back because you are calling out individual behaviors. You are calling out individual misinterpretations of the work that we do. So you can be seen in some circles as an agitator, but squeaky wheel gets the oil.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And I think, there's so many layers to what you just covered. One thing I think about so much when it comes to funding is I think we would be hard pressed to find another government entity that touches as many people as we do that is mainly sourced by part-time and temporary workers. We had in my previous role, both in Cobb and in Arlington, most of the work was done by part-time workers who were working full-time hours, but we didn't have full-time positions to give them because that's expensive on the county. Then you have to offer benefits, and then, it's a lot different, but then we had part-time workers working 40, 50, 60 hours a week, and that's what we had to do to get it done. And so that directly ties to the funding, and I think, like you said, the lack of understanding of what it takes to get elections done. I'm sure you could have 100 full-time people and it still wouldn't be enough because when you're in the midst of a huge election, it is more than all hands on deck. And I think that that's kind of something that's unique to elections is how we staff and we always make it work. That's kind of our strength, but also sometimes it's what gets us in trouble because that's what then legislators say. Well, they got through 2020 fine. They can handle this. And so sometimes it kind of comes back to bite us, but show up and you do it anyways.
There is a hard analogy for a lot of people to understand when you hear titles like elections and registration. What I tell people is we're in logistic management. We manage people, places, and things that all have to be moved and all have to be happen simultaneously. A good analogy for my sports fans out there is a standard Super Bowl stadium holds about 70 to 72,000 people. We have elections where we move that number of people through precincts, through multiple locations, providing people, places, staff, down to the piece of paper or the pen that you're using in that location. We don't own any of these locations. We're coordinating with pastors, worship leaders, community centers and their directors, a whole host of people to pull this off. But back to my Super Bowl analogy, you did not think that that Super Bowl was planned 15 minutes before then, 2 weeks before then. You know the years of effort that go into pulling off this single day event where for us in the state of Georgia, we're pulling these events off with 3 weeks advance voting, with election day, with for every major election these last 5 years, a runoff election attached to every election, where that runoff period has been shortened because what the legislature proposed as a hardship on elected officials running for office. But what I don't think that they consider is what are the administrative burdens that have to happen to basically turn around what took you months or years to do at one point, do it in a few weeks and do it to a level of perfection that any mistake that you have is going to be attributed to you personally and going to be attributed to you intentionally trying to do something. If the new one thing right now, we are under a microscope that I don't think any other administrative professional can completely understand if you have not worked in this space.
I completely agree. You don't think we don't know who the one person who is in charge of the Super Bowl is, right? But everyone knows who the election director is, and they get that blame if one little thing goes wrong. Whereas in the Super Bowl, if the fireworks don't fire at the right time or if the flyover is late, then that's just how it is. And so I love that analogy. I think that that is a really good way to help people understand the volume of what we do, like you said, on a regular basis, and then turn around and do it again for a runoff, in an even shorter amount of time. So I love that. Thank you for sharing. I recently had Tawny Adams on, and we talked a little bit about the upcoming special session that we have right after the runoff. I'd love to hear about how you're feeling about that session and the potential implications on changing how Georgia voters mark their ballot potentially this year.
I would encourage individuals, sometimes individuals in the legislature and the general public, voting rights advocates and things like that, that profess to be elections experts. I would urge cautions, I would urge patience, I would urge them to listen to elections officials. We have conducted a general primary. We're in the midst of conducting a general election. The voters of this state now have had multiple consecutive elections voting a particular way. I would urge caution going into the general election for the same election year with doing major changes to the way that people vote. It takes time to train poll workers. It takes time to, like I say, create materials. It takes time to educate the general public of how they're voting. I think that any changes to the way people vote should be a multi-year process by which in smaller election years that we know we're going to have lower turnout, that's the time frame that you build out your policies and your procedures. That's the time that you change elections equipment. That's the time that you build in those redundancies that you have to have in elections. I do not personally, and this is my opinion as an elections official, like I say, having conducted elections for a decade and a half in this state. Give us the time to work out any procedural changes that you're going to make with elections. Don't do a rushed implementation. We've had a rushed implementation of a completely changed an election system before. And how did that work out? Yes, elections officials pulled it off, but did that increase voter confidence? Did that accomplish any of the operational goals that you said that you were setting as to why you were making the change? Use that as your North Star when evaluating any proposed changes to elections. And if you feel that postponing those changes to give yourself time to work out those policies and procedures to actually write the rules in a logistical manner, that is not a bad thing. Slow and steady wins the race. That's my message toward the legislature as they go into this legislative session, to be mindful, to consider all of the implications and the ramifications of your decision making, and don't just always listen to the loudest voices in the room, because sometimes those loud voices in the room have their own reasons behind why they are pushing a political agenda or pushing a policy agenda. But is that the best solution for the voters of this state? Tried and true is a reason and is a word source for a reason.
Absolutely. You're taking us to church today. I could not agree with you more. I think it's so tough because we show up and we testify and we provide expert testimony and we, encourage our voters to contact their elected officials, and sometimes they listen and sometimes they don't. And we still show up to work anyways, right? And that is tough. And I'm cautiously optimistic about the special session. But like you said, I also encourage our election advocates to rely on their local election officials to be the experts in the room. And if voters are interested, to call your local election official and ask, well, moving to hand mark seems so much easier. Why are you saying it's so hard? And they will be happy to explain exactly what you just did, all of the logistics, all of the paperwork, all the behind the scenes. It's not just as simple as printing out a bunch of pieces of paper and buying pens. It's so much more than that. And I hope that that's something, a strong message that we can continue to reiterate as we head into the special session. And I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot of each other on the Hill or at the Capitol over the next couple of weeks. But
I have gone to the doctor before for on many occasions, but I know that despite what I read online, despite what medical books I can pick up, despite what I hear in the news and media, I know that when I enter this doctor's office, I have to trust the professional that has gone to school and studied this, that it continues to operate. within an ethical framework, doing continuing education that has made himself or herself the subject matter expert on these healthcare issues. I have to listen to them as the subject matter expert. And despite what personal research I feel that I do myself, I have to lean, trust, and depend upon this expert with helping me to shape my medical decisions. And I would hope that elections officials would be recognized as the professionals that they are, as the subject matter experts they are when they are testifying before these different committees, when they are engaging with the general public and giving their unbiased opinions on a practical matter as it relates to elections administration. I would hope that the general public and our elected officials would trust these professionals because they are professionals.
That's right. Ugh, I love it. Perfect. All right. Final question. What is the one thing you would like for voters to remember as we are in the middle of a very busy election year?
The one thing, grace. Grace for me is understanding to pack your patience. Grace for me is understanding that you have to plan out your actions. You have to check on your information. You have to get information from legitimate sources. You have to be intentional with the movements that you're making, that applies to your vote, that applies to your decision making, that applies to your life. Grace for me is intentionality, being intentional with your words, being intentional with your actions, and understanding that elections officials are human. Extend them grace. Extend them grace in your criticisms of them, in your interaction with them, in your understanding of the work that they do.
Love it. I think that that's so important because it's not that people shouldn't be held accountable. It's to extend grace when asking those questions and trying to figure out what happened. So I love that. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. Well, thank you for joining me today. This has been so fun and for sharing your insights with our listeners. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another episode talking with more keepers of our republic.
If you like this episode, please share it on social media and tell your friends. It's the best way for folks to find out about us. I hope you'll agree that our guest is indeed a keeper of the Republic. If you want to learn more about how you can help keep our Republic, stop on over to our website, keepourrepublic.org.